The gods do not choose mortals lightly, and when they do, it is never without consequence. In the lands where mountains meet distant seas, there ruled a king whose name was spoken with a mixture of admiration and unease. Not because he was cruel in the way tyrants are cruel, nor because he was weak in the way failing kings are weak, but because he had been touched by something that did not belong to his world. Tantalus was not born a god, but he lived as if the boundary no longer applied to him. His kingdom flourished beneath his rule. Wealth gathered in his halls. Offerings arrived without demand. Envoys spoke of him not as a distant ruler, but as one whose presence felt strangely elevated, almost removed from ordinary men. And yet, what made Tantalus exceptional was not his kingdom. It was where he was allowed to go. Olympus was not a place mortals were meant to linger in, but Tantalus did. At the tables of the divine, he was permitted to sit among forces that shaped storms, seasons, and fate itself. He listened as gods spoke not in prayers or symbols, but in certainty, in absolute knowledge, in truths that did not bend for interpretation. And in that presence, something in him began to shift. At first it was admiration, then fascination, then something far more dangerous: comparison. Tantalus began to notice what others would have never dared to think, that even the gods, in their perfection, revealed patterns, preferences, blind spots hidden beneath certainty. And where others saw divinity, he began to see structure, and structure could be understood. If it could be understood, it could be tested. The change did not happen in a single moment. It settled slowly, like a thought that refuses to leave once it has entered the mind. Mortals around him noticed first in silence, not words, the way he no longer spoke of the gods with reverence alone, but with reflection, as if they were no longer beings above comprehension, but systems just beyond full clarity. Even his court grew quieter in his presence, because there is a particular kind of silence that forms around a mind beginning to separate itself from limits. His son, Pelops, still moved within his life, young, present, alive in the way children are alive before they understand distance. There was a time when Tantalus would have looked at him and seen continuation, legacy, meaning beyond himself. But as his thoughts expanded toward the divine, something else narrowed. Human connection began to feel small, not unimportant, just insufficient. One evening, Tantalus stood alone within his palace, watching the horizon where sky and earth seemed to press against each other without ever fully merging. The world below felt structured, limited, readable. The world above did not, and that imbalance troubled him more than he admitted, because anything that cannot be understood eventually becomes a question that demands an answer. And Tantalus had begun to believe that answers were not given. They were taken. It was during one of his returns from Olympus that the idea first took full shape, not as a decision, but as an intrusion. A thought so sudden it felt less like invention and more like revelation. If the gods were truly omniscient, then nothing hidden could exist in their presence. And if something could be hidden, then even divinity could be deceived. The idea did not feel immediately immoral. It felt clarifying, as though reality itself had revealed a seam where truth could be tested. But testing truth requires material, and in the mind of Tantalus, material was not abstract. It was personal. Days passed differently after that. The world around him continued its motion, unaware that something irreversible was forming within its center. His court still spoke to him. His people still obeyed him. Even his son still looked at him without suspicion. But Tantalus was no longer participating in the world as it was. He was evaluating it, measuring it, preparing it, and somewhere, far beyond mortal sight, something ancient began to shift its attention toward him, not in punishment yet, but in recognition. Because the moment a mortal begins to question the structure of divine certainty, the gods do not ignore it for long. Tantalus, however, mistook silence for distance, and distance for safety. He believed he still had time. That thought would prove to be the first error, because there are ideas that do not remain ideas for long. They become decisions waiting for permission. And in the mind of a king who had once sat among gods, permission was no longer something he felt he needed to ask for. Some thoughts do not arrive as questions. They arrive as inevitability. In the days after his return from Olympus, Tantalus found himself increasingly detached from the rhythm of his own world. The court still functioned. Decisions were still made. Voices still filled the halls. But they no longer reached him in the same way. It was as if he stood slightly outside of himself, observing a life that continued out of habit rather than meaning. And beneath that distance, the idea remained, not fading, refining. The gods were not just beings of power, they were beings of perception. Their authority did not come only from strength, but from awareness. Nothing escaped them. Nothing remained concealed. That was the assumption. But assumptions, once questioned, rarely return to innocence. Tantalus began to observe differently. Not the people of his court, not the borders of his kingdom, but the nature of knowledge itself. He replayed every moment spent among the divine, every glance, every silence, every exchange that had once felt simple, now appeared layered with potential meaning. If the gods knew all, then every action must already be known before it occurred. And if every action was already known, then choice was not freedom. It was performance. This thought did not frighten him, it fascinated him, because a world that is already known is a world that can, in theory, be mapped, and a mapped world can be tested. One evening, he stood before his son. Pelops was still young enough to move through life without awareness of structure. He did not question why things were as they were. He simply lived within them, trusting the world to remain coherent. That kind of trust is something only the unburdened possess. Tantalus studied him in silence, not with hostility, not with warmth, but with calculation that had not yet decided its own form. Pelops spoke something simple, words that might have once drawn a smile, or a reply softened by affection. But Tantalus did not respond immediately, because something within him had begun to separate, not love from cruelty, not father from king, but perception from participation. And in that separation, people become objects of meaning rather than sources of connection. Later, alone again, Tantalus began to refine the idea further. If the gods truly saw all things, then deception should be impossible, not difficult, not rare. Impossible, but impossibility is a statement that demands verification when placed in the mind of someone who has already stood at divine tables. And verification requires a test, a controlled contradiction, a situation in which truth must reveal itself under pressure. Tantalus did not call it a plan yet, not even in his thoughts. He called it understanding, a method of seeing whether reality behaved as it claimed to behave. But beneath language, intention was forming its shape, regardless of what it was named. He began to withdraw from ordinary court life. Meetings became shorter, conversations more indirect. Questions he once answered with certainty were now met with silence, as if he were measuring not the answers themselves, but the reactions they produced. His people noticed the change, but they interpreted it incorrectly. They thought it was distance born of divinity. A king growing closer to gods must naturally grow farther from men. They did not see that it was not elevation. It was disconnection. And disconnection, left long enough, becomes permission. One night, Tantalus stood alone at the edge of his palace once more. The wind moved across the stone like something searching for meaning it could not find. And in that silence, the idea stopped feeling like thought. It started feeling like direction. If the gods could not be deceived, then nothing would happen when deception was attempted. But if something did happen, then their nature was not absolute. And if their nature was not absolute, then everything built upon that assumption was open to revision. The conclusion did not arrive with shock. It arrived with calm clarity. And that calmness was what made it dangerous. because the mind rarely resists what feels like logic, even when logic is built on fracture. Tantalus turned his gaze toward his world again, not as a ruler, not as a father, but as someone preparing to place a question into reality itself, a question that could not be unanswered, because it was not meant to be spoken, it was meant to be done. And somewhere beyond mortal sight, attention began to gather. Not yet intervention, not yet judgment, but awareness sharpening into focus. Because there are ideas that the divine does not ignore, not because they are loud, but because they are precise. And precision, when aimed at truth, always demands a response. There are moments in a life where thought stops being private, not because it is spoken, but because it is crossed. For Tantalus, that moment did not arrive with noise or revelation. It arrived with silence so complete it felt deliberate, like the world itself had stepped back to observe what would be done next. By now, the idea had changed form. It was no longer abstract. It had direction. It had weight. And it had a name that Tantalus still refused to say aloud, even inside his own mind. A test, but not of strength, not of war, of perception. If the gods truly saw everything, then nothing could be hidden from them. Not intention, not disguise, not consequence. And if something could be hidden, then divinity itself was not what it claimed to be. That question no longer lived in theory. It required an answer made of reality. And reality, once altered, does not return to its original shape. He began to withdraw further from the world he ruled. The court no longer felt like a center of authority, but like a place where voices gathered around someone already no longer fully present. Decisions were made without the same emotional weight. Orders were given without hesitation or reflection. People mistook this for control, but it was detachment. And detachment is where morality begins to lose its resistance. At the heart of this distance remained one presence that had not yet fully dissolved into abstraction. Pelops. A child still young enough that the world had not yet asked him to question its shape. He trusted what he saw. He trusted what was given. He trusted that presence meant safety. That trust in Tantalus's mind had become something else entirely. Not innocence, but material. One evening, Tantalus stood watching him from a distance longer than he should have. There was no immediate emotion attached to the act, no visible conflict, no outward struggle, only observation layered over calculation. Pelops laughed at something unseen, a sound that did not yet understand consequence. It should have anchored something in Tantalus. It should have pulled him backward toward recognition of what he was. But instead, it highlighted something else. Fragility. Not emotional fragility. Structural. the fragility of all things that depend on assumption rather than verification. If even divine perception could be questioned, then so too could the boundaries that defined moral certainty. And that was where the line began to blur, not in a single decision, but in the slow acceptance that no line was fixed. The idea no longer asked permission. It simply remained present, waiting for the moment when hesitation would no longer be stronger than curiosity. And eventually, that moment arrived, not as climax, but as absence of resistance. There was no declaration, no spoken command, only movement. Tantalus began preparing in silence. What followed was not ritual in the traditional sense. There were no visible signs of ceremony, no grand symbolic preparation. It was something quieter, more clinical, a sequence of actions stripped of emotional framing so that meaning could not interrupt execution. The world around him continued unchanged. That, perhaps, is what made it possible, because reality does not prevent contradiction, it only records it. And so the act approached not like a storm, but like inevitability taking physical form. Tantalus did not justify it to himself. Justification implies doubt. What he held was not doubt. It was conviction shaped by curiosity, so deep it had replaced hesitation. If the gods knew all, then nothing would be revealed by this act that they did not already see. And if they did not know, then they were not what they were believed to be. Either outcome, in his mind, led to knowledge, and knowledge, to him, had become more important than consequence. There was a final moment before the line was crossed, a moment where time did not stop, but narrowed, where the world did not react, but waited. Pelops was there, unaware, unshielded, existing within a reality that still believed itself stable. And Tantalus stood at the edge of what he had become, not yet acting, not yet returning, suspended between identity and intention. And then the line was crossed, not described in detail, not experienced as spectacle, but understood as rupture, a point after which the world could no longer claim innocence in what followed. And in that rupture, something irreversible entered existence, not immediately as punishment, but as recognition. Somewhere beyond sight, attention sharpened, not in anger, not in confusion, but in certainty, because there are acts that do not need interpretation. They simply confirm what has already been seen, and once seen, cannot be ignored. There are silences that feel like peace, and there are silences that feel like waiting. In the aftermath of what had been set in motion, Tantalus experienced neither. What came instead was a strange continuation of normality, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge that something fundamental had already been altered. His court continued to function. His halls continued to fill. His voice, when it was needed, still carried authority, but internally, something had shifted in a way that no external structure could correct. It was not regret. Not yet. It was anticipation, because a test is not complete at the moment it is performed. It is complete at the moment of response, and that response had not yet come. At Olympus, silence was not ignorance, it was observation. The gods did not react quickly to mortal actions, not because they were unaware, but because awareness among the divine does not operate on the same urgency as mortal thought. What matters is not speed, but clarity. And clarity, once achieved, removes ambiguity entirely. When the summons came, it was not spoken in words. It was understood as inevitability. Tantalus was invited, once again, to the divine table, to a feast among the gods, a continuation of the privilege he had once believed to be favor. But now it felt different, not elevated, but exposed. He accepted without hesitation, because hesitation implies the possibility of reversal, and he had already passed the point where reversal was meaningful. The journey upward was unchanged from before, yet everything within him interpreted it differently. The air of Olympus no longer felt like honor. It felt like distance closing in from all sides at once, as if he were moving not toward safety, but toward resolution. When he arrived, the gods were already present. Zeus presided with calm stillness that did not require expression to communicate authority. Around him, the divine gathered not in chaos, but in structured attention, each presence aware, each presence observing, and yet nothing was said immediately, because what needed to be known had already been seen. The feast began as it always had. Food placed, wine poured, conversation flowing with the ease of beings who do not need to conceal thought from one another. Tantalus sat among them, and for the first time, he understood that he was not participating. He was being observed, not as guest, not as king, but as question whose answer had already been partially revealed. Time moved differently in that space, not slower, not faster, simply without distraction. Every gesture, every pause, every glance carried weight that could not be ignored, and beneath it all, an absence sat at the center of perception. Something missing, not spoken, not named, but present in its removal. The gods did not accuse. They did not interrogate. They did not need to. Because truth, when revealed in full, does not require dialogue. It only requires recognition. Tantalus felt it before it was spoken, not as sound, but as collapse. The realization that what he had attempted to test was already known before the test existed, that the boundary he believed he had challenged had never been uncertain at all. It had only been permitted to appear so, and in that permission, he had revealed himself completely. The shift was subtle, no sudden anger, no immediate punishment, just stillness deepening into finality. And then, the gods withdrew from the illusion of normality, not physically at first, but perceptually. The feast no longer functioned as feast. It became exposure, a moment suspended where reality and consequence aligned perfectly. Tantalus understood then that what he had done was not a successful test, nor a failed one. It was unnecessary, because nothing had been hidden from the beginning, and that realization did not bring relief. It brought erasure of illusion. The gods rose, not in haste, but in completion. And in that movement, judgment ceased to be potential. It became structure. What followed was not chaos. It was correction. The divine did not need to argue with what had already been confirmed. They only needed to place it where it belonged. Tantalus was no longer among them, not through exile in the traditional sense, but through removal from alignment. The presence that had once allowed him proximity to divinity was withdrawn as if it had never been permanent. And in that withdrawal, something deeper than punishment began. Identity loss. The collapse of position, meaning, and place within any structure that could recognize him as he had been. As he was led away, the world above no longer felt like height. It felt like distance becoming absolute. And somewhere behind him, the idea he had once called understanding finally revealed its true form. Not insight, but consequence, waiting for recognition. There is a moment when punishment is not yet suffering, only transition, a quiet stripping away of what a being once assumed was permanent. For Tantalus, that moment began not with pain, but with separation. Separation from status, from proximity, from the fragile illusion that proximity to divinity had ever made him equal to it. He was no longer a king among mortals, no longer a guest among gods. He was something undefined, moving downward through layers of reality that no longer responded to his presence as meaningful authority. The world above receded without drama, not collapsing, not shouting, just withdrawing, as if existence itself had decided that his place within it had been reassigned. The path led into the domain of the irreversible. The underworld was not a place in the mortal sense. It was structure without warmth, order without comfort, memory without change. And as Tantalus crossed into it, he felt something unfamiliar begin to replace everything he had once mistaken for control. Absence of response. In the mortal world, actions produce consequences. In the divine world, actions produce judgment. But here, beneath both, there was something else. Fixation. The moment Tantalus stepped fully into that realm, the nature of his existence shifted from narrative to condition. He was no longer someone who had done something. He was something that had been done to. And that distinction is the foundation of eternal punishment. At first, there was no torment, only placement. A space formed around him, not empty, but defined. Defined by absence of resolution, defined by permanence. He looked around, and what he saw was not chaos, but certainty, without variation. And in that certainty, his mind began to search instinctively for structure, for continuation, for change. But none came, because this place does not respond to effort. It only reflects it. The first sensation arrived slowly, not hunger, not thirst, but awareness of both as concepts without fulfillment, a tension that could not resolve itself through action. Where he stood, there was water. Below him, it moved with a clarity that suggested invitation. Above him, branches hung heavy with fruit, ripe, close, almost within reach, almost. And that word became the architecture of his reality, almost reachable, almost satisfied, almost ending, but never crossing into completion. He reached. The water withdrew. He reached again. The fruit lifted away. No anger accompanied this. At first, only confusion, because the mind expects systems to stabilize, even suffering systems, especially suffering systems. But this one did not stabilize. It adapted just enough to maintain impossibility. Time became meaningless, not through absence, but through repetition. Each attempt identical, each outcome unchanged, each expectation renewed only to be denied in precisely the same way. And slowly, something deeper than pain began to form. Recognition without escape. He was no longer being punished once. He was being made aware continuously. The difference is everything, because pain ends. But awareness that cannot resolve itself does not end. It repeats. Somewhere beyond the visible edges of his existence, the structure of punishment remained unchanged, not as cruelty, but as consequence that had fully detached from moral emotion. There was no hatred in it, no satisfaction, only alignment between action and outcome made permanent. And within that alignment, Tantalus remained, not breaking, not escaping, not progressing, only existing in the space between desire and fulfillment, where every attempt reinforces the same truth. What is reached for cannot be reached. What is desired cannot be obtained. And what is tested against the divine does not yield contradiction. It yields structure. he would reach again, and again, and again. Not because he believed the outcome would change, but because the mind, stripped of all other anchors, continues the only behavior it still recognizes as meaningful: attempt and failure, without variation, without conclusion. And somewhere within that repetition, the idea that had once driven him, the need to understand the gods, no longer mattered, because understanding requires contrast, and there was no contrast here, only permanence. There is a point where suffering stops feeling like an event and becomes condition. For Tantalus, that point had long passed. What remained was not memory of a crime, nor anticipation of release, only structure, unchanging, repeating, absolute. Beneath the stillness of the underworld, time no longer behaved as it once had in life. There was no sunrise to divide moments, no sleep to soften awareness, no progress to suggest movement forward, only recurrence. The water beneath him shimmered with the same deceptive invitation it had held since the beginning. The fruit above him hung in the same impossible nearness. Nothing aged, nothing decayed, nothing resolved, because resolution would imply an end, and this place does not permit endings. Tantalus reached again, not with hope, not with expectation, but with reflex shaped by endless repetition. His hand moved upward, and the fruit shifted away. Always the same distance, always just beyond the threshold where action becomes fulfillment. Behind him, the water rose slightly, then receded again before contact could occur. Not as mockery, not as reaction, but as fixed law. And slowly, something within him began to change in a way more profound than pain. The mind adapts. Even here. At first, he remembered why he reached. Then he remembered that remembering had no consequence. Then even memory began to lose relevance, because memory implies comparison between states. And here, there is only one state. Endless continuation of unfulfilled desire. The word that would one day be born from his existence, tantalize, did not yet exist in language, but it existed perfectly in experience. Desire maintained at maximum proximity, without transition into satisfaction. Not absence of fulfillment, but prevention of it. That distinction became everything, because absence can be endured, but prevention cannot be resolved. There were moments, though calling them moments no longer felt accurate, when awareness expanded beyond immediate action. In those intervals, Tantalus perceived something deeper about what he had become. He was no longer being corrected. He was being defined. The punishment was not response to the act. It was the act made eternal in structure, a reflection that does not fade, a consequence that does not conclude. And somewhere Within that realization, understanding finally detached itself from emotion entirely. What remained was recognition without resistance. He would reach and fail, not because of error, but because failure was now the only permitted outcome. Above him, below him, around him, nothing changed. Not gods observing, not voices judging, not even anger sustaining the moment. Only the perfect absence of variation. In mortal life, repetition becomes habit. In divine punishment, repetition becomes identity. And identity, once reduced to a single unbroken loop, no longer requires awareness of anything outside itself. Tantalus did not forget who he had been, but that version of him no longer had functional meaning here. King was irrelevant, father was unreachable, guest of gods was impossible. Even offender lost weight, because offense implies a before and after, and there is no after here, only continuation. And so he remained, not collapsing, not ascending, not changing, reaching toward what could never be reached, learning without relief that desire itself had been separated from outcome permanently. And in that separation, something final became clear. This was not punishment that ends suffering. It was punishment that removes the possibility of ending. Not pain as event, but longing as structure, forever sustained, forever denied, forever aware.